Welcome to Spoonable Standpoint, the podcast where your hosts Leo and Charlene dig into food culture. In this episode, we'll be talking about school lunch, how we've experienced it, and how it can change to be the best it can, not just for the students' enjoyment, but for their health as well.
So, how did we go from counting ketchup as a vegetable in the 80s to being so strict about school lunch guidelines now? What about before the 80s? Let's get into school lunch history. By 1900, 34 of the then 45 states made education for children under the age of 14 mandatory. Many politicians knew that this was an opportunity to give the children of the poor laborers a good, healthy, and balanced meal for lunch, since it would have been harder for them to have one at home. That is why school lunch began, a vessel of health for all the children. But as we know about the American government around this time, that did not stick.
Later, during the Great Depression, school lunch became a federal standard, and surplus crops were served in school. These crops were obtained under a part of the New Deal called the AAA, or the Agricultural Adjustment Act. Its objective was to raise crop prices in order to stimulate the economy, and buying these surpluses was part of it.
The other day, I was actually reading about some of the meals eaten during this Great Depression and found something called mashed hot bread soup. Essentially, it was just a piece of stale bread covered in olive oil and salt, but soaked in boiling water and mashed. Now, I don't know about you, but that doesn't sound too great compared to the more substantial school food, and I think this really shows how much importance was placed on these school lunches back then, since obviously mashed hot bread soup doesn't contain many, if any, nutrients. Things seemed to be going well, but eventually took a sharp turn in the wrong direction. In contrast to the Nixon and Eisenhower administrations and the Child Nutrition Act of 1966, the Reagan administration lowered the budget for school lunch in 1981 by $1.5 billion.
I stated a moment ago our intention to keep the school breakfast and lunch programs for those in true need. But by cutting back on meals for children of families who can afford to pay, the savings will be $1.6 billion in fiscal year 1982.
This meant that students were not getting higher quality lunches, and to meet the budget, schools had to cut corners to meet bare minimum health standards. This is where the original intent of school lunch started to be lost in the wind, as incredibly unhealthy foods became the staple of school lunch. Around the time of the Reagan-era lunch, obesity rates in America began to skyrocket because of these unhealthy meals.
And these obesity rates began to rise more and more and more. And over the next decades, the health of the children became of greater and greater concern. According to the State of Childhood Obesity Organization, childhood obesity rates rose from 5% in 1978 to 18.5% by 2016. One of the main contributing factors of this rise was the incredibly unhealthy school lunch. However, in 2010, Congress passed the Healthy, Hunger-Free Kids Act, which Obama refers to as doing what is right for our children. This was made in order to limit that school lunch factor that helped cause those incredibly high rates of obesity.
So we need to make sure our kids have the energy and the capacity to go toe-to-toe with any of their peers anywhere in the world. And we need to make sure that they're all reaching their potential. That's precisely what this bill, the Healthy, Hungry, Free Kids Act, will accomplish.
It was meant to revert school lunches back to what their original intention was, a vessel of health for all the children. But has it achieved what it set out to do? Let's discuss. So, when I was in kindergarten, school lunch was the very basic fried food. It was chicken nuggets and mozzarella sticks and french fries, all the delicious stuff. That year, the PTA at my elementary school was trying to get this program called Wellness in the Schools into the school. Wellness in the Schools is a great program. I'm just going to put that out there. At the time, when it was first introduced in first grade, it was not the best because I was expecting chicken nuggets and I got butternut squash ravioli. But in the end, it was a great program because we were eating healthier. They also helped us organize exercises out in the schoolyard. The best part of it was that sometimes we would skip a class and we would go and get to learn how to cook food. I remember the first time I had kale chips. It was during that, and it was the most delicious thing I ever had. I was like, how are these not made of potato? So that was a great program, but the biggest problem with the program at the time, and I think still, is the fact that the school lunch, even though it was healthy, it wasn't 100% well made. Mm-hmm. And that's the fault of nobody. Having to make a bulk amount of food is difficult.
Definitely. My
elementary school was big. So they had to make a lot of food. Therefore, the food wasn't quality controlled as much as the recipes wanted them to be. And that led to just not the best food experience.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And it was great that your school pushed WITS. It seems like a great program, the fact that they had you guys so hands-on with the school food experience. I think that's definitely a very valuable experience, especially for you. It's when you were younger in like first grade. I remember the school that I went to had a much more different approach. They didn't really change much. They didn't add an additional school lunch program. They basically kept the school food the same past the Healthy and Hunger-Free Kids Act in 2010. So yes, the school food itself was healthier, but we never really got that hands-on experience. What my school did was they put posters everywhere encouraging kids to take healthier options, take their milk, take their fruits, pushing kids to lead more healthier lifestyles, and they were everywhere. So I feel like that's more of like a subconscious approach, trying to get that ingrained in the kids' minds rather than having them be involved in the school lunch, in a more hands-on way.
Yeah. That's a really interesting point you bring up. Like, does subconscious work better than conscious? Because I know that one of the DOE regulations, at least in New York City, and I'm sure nationwide, is that all students are supposed to take a fruit and a vegetable for lunch. So, you get your plate that has broccoli on it. I don't know, carrots, whatever. And they say, go take an apple. And for me, I don't really like eating a raw apple because they're just like, they're mushy and they're not that great. So when I'm being forced to do something, especially when you're a kid, you don't want to do it. If someone says take fruit, you're going to be like, no, I don't want to take the fruit. But if you're taught at a young age, or it's ingrained in your mind at a young age, that fruit is good, it's delicious, there are great ways to make it, and it benefits your body, then when you're older, you're just going to take a pear and eat it. When we were in person in high school, I would have like 1 or 2 pears every single day because they were delicious. And they were right there, so I could have as many as I wanted. So, but I really don't know how I would be now if I didn't have that kind of program. Do you think those posters like really benefited you, or do you think it was more of like something that your mind just kind of like, man, it doesn't matter?
Yeah, I think it was definitely the latter. They may have been subconsciously trying to get us to eat healthier. At the end of the day, they still gave us apples on every tray. Yeah. They still made us take bananas. So you did make an interesting point before that kids just won't do something if they're being told to do it. But no matter what, they were still being forced to take a fruit because, like you said, it's a standard. So while there was an attempt with the posters and all, I think over time kids just accepted that as being, something that's there in their cafeteria. I don't think they really
it was like a learning
took
experience.
That meat. Yeah, they never really got much out of it. I know I didn't, and I know a lot of my peers didn't, as we still didn't really enjoy the school food because of how strict the regulations are. But it really shows that health is an important goal for schools and governments. But at what cost?
Yeah, and going back to being forced to take something and adding on to what you're saying, there was so much food waste. Elementary school, and I thought it was just going to be elementary school because, I would see kids taking like a bite of their butternut squash ravioli or their chickpea pesto pasta and just being like, nah, I don't really like it, and then throwing it away. Same thing with like the vegetables and the fruits. But no, when I went into middle school, I realized it wasn't just because we were eating like healthier stuff. It's just because kids won't always eat as much as people think they do. And they want like a certain thing, I think. And when all you're given is like a little bit of mac and cheese and then a lot of broccoli and like 2 apples or whatever, they're probably not going to eat the broccoli or the 2 apples. I'm going to take a few bites of it, and they might not like it because the food isn't the highest quality. And that's, again, to no one's fault. That's just because of the small amount of quality control. And there really is so much food waste in the schools.
Yeah, I definitely agree that there is a lot of food waste in schools. And just like you, I remember seeing in schools that kids would take a bite out of something and just throw it out. Kids would just finish what they'd like to eat and then throw out the rest. And according to Penn State News, people found that up to 53% of school food served per plate is wasted.
Yeah. In my own personal experiences, I would say that 53% sounds like a good number because they want you to have a balanced meal. So they have dairy, grains, and fruits and vegetables. But the fruits and vegetables just didn't taste very good. They couldn't be salted all that much, so then that kind of like seasoned flavor. And all it was like boiled broccoli. And that results in a lot of food waste. It also results in money lost for the school.
Exactly. And
schools already lose so much money to school lunch. I found a few statistics from Kaplan. The lunch cost per child is about $3.81. That does not just cover the food, it also covers the labor, the equipment, electricity, all that kind of stuff. The reimbursement rate is about $3.32. So that means the schools are losing 49 cents. And 49 cents per child, that's a pretty good investment. But I'm sure a lot of the food that's being wasted falls under that 49%. So they're investing in the children, but their investment isn't fully paid off because they're not eating that full lunch.
I wouldn't expect a school lunch to cost $3.81 per student. At first glance, it just does not seem true because I remember all we really get was like a scoop of the main dish and then 2 side dishes and like an apple and maybe a milk. I don't think that costs $3.81. That, especially when a lot of it is being sourced for free by the USDA and being bought in bulk. I think it's really unlikely, but when you bring in the factor of labor, electricity, and it having to be cooked, it's definitely an investment. So what I want to know is how exactly is that money being invested? And if there's a better way to invest it, because at the end of the day, health is the school's priority and the government's priority from what we've seen with all these actions and things to push health.
Well, I think a good solution, and a lot of these come from a New York Times article where they interviewed a lot of students, and these students had some really great thoughts. Stuff I would have hadn't even thought about. One student named Jan Sosa talked about how there should be more diverse options in what we eat. If you go into a cafeteria, most of the stuff is like burgers and fries. Even though it's supposed to be low sodium and everything, it is low sodium. No trans fat, well, whatever. It is still very much like that unhealthy school lunch. We still get mozzarella sticks somehow, even though they're not fried, they're probably baked. What this student said was, you need to show more cultural identities. Not just like the Americana identity.
I definitely agree.
There are so many recipes out there in the world that use really cheap like vegetables that are really cheap in the US as well. They don't put that much in, but they're the most delicious thing ever. And they're not very hard to make. You can make a really good like lentil soup. And that can be made in bulk easily. And there is good quality control. with making that kind of soup. So I think the future of school lunch would be moving away from what we think of school lunch now and getting into new tastes.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that, student, and with your points as well. Every week we'd have like a schedule. That would be one of like the biggest posters up that I'd see even in elementary school and high school.
Yeah.
It would be like Meatless Monday, and every Tuesday we'd have burgers. Every Wednesday would be like Culinary Wednesday, and that was just the chicken dumpling Wednesday. But yeah, over time, even if the school food was good, if you're having the same thing every week, the recycle every week, kids are going to get bored.
Yeah, I'm the kind of person who I can't really eat the same thing over and over again because my taste buds start to be like, okay, this doesn't taste very good. It tastes a little bland. I think I'm full. And I want to go for something else to eat because I'm not full. I'll have like a few bites of it and be like, I'm not full at all.
Mm-hmm.
So I would turn to the vending machines.
Yes.
And this is obviously a shared experience because 71% of public non-charter high schools in the United States have a vending machine of some sort in the cafeteria. Mm-hmm. And I'm sure a lot of them sell the same stuff that they sold to us, like popcorn and Doritos and Cheetos. Obviously all with no trans fat, but I was turning to these more unhealthy options because of these boring, healthier options. It's a little bit like the opposite effect, I think, of what the government and the DOE wanted to happen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I would remember we'd have school lunch, right? Not only were the portions way too small for a high school student, it was food that people just didn't want to eat, Yeah. There were some days where I skipped lunch completely because it just wasn't really edible,
Yeah.
I think having something is better than eating nothing. And there were times, and after that, I started bringing, granola bars and cookies to school to try to sustain myself because even after lunch, 2 hours later, I'd be starving.
Yeah, and I would be the same. I'm a pretty big guy. I need myself some food, and we had food a little bit earlier in the day, which obviously doesn't contribute to having an appetite. But middle of the day, we would have a small lunch and have to go through the rest of the day. When my dad picked me up most days, I would pass out in the car. Like, I had a long ride home. I think about 75% of the ride, I would be asleep. Because I would be so tired at the end of the day. I would not be able to keep my eyes open. And I'm sure it's because I didn't eat enough. Not necessarily because I didn't eat all the food, but because maybe we weren't given enough food. There were a lot of times where they would serve us only like one thing. There were some days where cheesy garlic bread was our lunch.
Yes.
You get a tray of 2 pieces of cheesy garlic bread. You would take a pair. And maybe that's because they didn't have a big enough budget, which is a whole separate problem. There needs to be better funding if that's the case.
That goes into another option for an alternative to improve school lunches. Because good food, especially in school lunch, is definitely harder to come by from what I've seen and from what you've seen. I remember back in middle school, they had really good garlic bread. The garlic bread was actually good. Like I would definitely eat it by choice. It was incredible. It really was good. And I remember a lot of the time they'd have like a tray of extra garlic bread. And as soon as they announced that tray of garlic bread being available for students to take, students would stampede to that tray and grab whatever they could. It would be insane. Like some kids wanted the garlic bread but wouldn't even bother because of how many other kids were there. And that really shows the power of good food that they have in school lunches. And definitely from what we mentioned before, a cultural variety would be a sustainable alternative.
Yeah. And probably better portions.
And better portion sizes, exactly. I remember reading how every grade bracket, like elementary school, middle school, and high school, would have a different amount of calories that school lunches were allowed to be. But that doesn't really account for how different the students are. Like I get if you had a regulation on elementary school, but in high school, someone who's 5'1" is getting the same amount of food as somebody who's like 6'3", and that I don't think makes sense.
Yeah. Obviously, the schools don't want huge portions. If a tourist comes to America, the first thing that they'll notice is that portions are about 5 times bigger. A burger and fries in Italy is going to be smaller than a burger and fries here, a lot smaller. But just because you don't want the portions to be big doesn't mean you can't have them be bigger than they are now. For a lot of kids, school lunch is the way that they get their daily intake of nutrients.
Exactly.
If you don't have enough food on the plate, enough food that they'll want to eat, you're not going to get that daily nutrient intake. So the future of school lunch, I'm going back to the future of school lunch because that's what we have to think about. Future of school lunch is going to be a little bit more food and food that kids want to eat, that kids even interact with. So the future of school lunch is just more interaction with food, better food, and probably more funding.
I remember a while back, international school lunches became viral, and one that is important to note is Japan's school lunch. It's filled with delicious looking foods, sustainable portions. The difference between school lunch in Japan and the school lunch in America is that in Japan, students are much more involved in the process. You have kids prepping the food, you have kids cleaning up, you have kids setting up the tables, putting away the tables. And a big problem that we mentioned before was having to cook so much food for so many kids in a little bit of time. And that's basically the solution. You have kids being involved in the process. You get a lot more done, and you get and as a return, you get better food, better portions, and an overall better experience.
And you're going to want to eat it. If we're more involved in the process, want to waste it. We'll want to get the most out of it.
When you're more involved in the process, you definitely feel more connected to it. You really want to enjoy the outcome of your hard work. That's definitely a really important part of the school lunch experience. School lunch has been an extremely beneficial aspect of education for over 100 years in America. It provided lunches to those who need it at an affordable, if no-cost way that gives students the nutrients they need to go through the day. But that does not mean that there are no further changes that should be introduced. Even though it's been transformed and it's metamorphosized into what we know as school lunch now, the basic idea of sitting down and eating with your friends has persevered through it all. Food is hospitality, and school lunch is no exception.